About today are some numerical schemes and also some results from these numerical schemes that I've been using to optimize chiral structures that have been fabricated in laboratories to generate artificial microscale propulsion. And this work that I've been doing has been in collaboration with Sean Walker at Louisiana State University and Mike Shelley at the Quran Institute. And so really the motivation of this problem comes from the laboratory and these magnetic microswimmers that have been fabricated now in various laboratories, beginning with this Dreyfus swimmer that we just heard mentioned in the talk before, that was developed or published. The work was published in 2005. And since that time, there's been this whole wide variety of various swimmers using different construction techniques to fabricate both flexible structures that can be actuated using magnetic fields or these rigid structures that contain embedded magnetic material. They can be fabricated using self-assembly techniques. They can be fabricated using various different kinds of deposition techniques from vapors. And recently, they've also been able to be functionalized. So for example, this one here has this little claw attached to the end of this rigid helical structure, and they're able to demonstrate it in this experiment, and also here in this one, that you can use this device to swim by, pick up a little colloidal particle, move it to a different location, and drop it. So we have all these different kinds of microswimmers, and what we'd like to do is say, well, can we say which one's best? Can we identify a particular construction technique that gives us the fastest swimmer for a given magnetic torque? And so yes, so these swimmers are actuated externally using magnetic torques that are due to the interaction between the dipole moment of these magnetic structures and this time-dependent magnetic field that is controlled by the user. And so two different kinds of magnetic field schemes have been used to actuate these devices. One, where you have a steady magnetic field to orient the swimmer in a particular swimming direction, and transverse to that, an oscillating magnetic field to create some kind of bending wave that might propagate down an elastic filament. And along with that, so there's this other actuation scheme that has been used, which again has this steady magnetic field to orient the swimmer, but also, instead of this transverse oscillating magnetic field, one that's rotating in time. And so this would be used in conjunction, say, with one of these helical rigid swimmers in order to rotate it, and allow for the shape of the swimmer to couples rotation and translation to facilitate the swimming. And of course, these two schemes that have been developed in the laboratories or used in the laboratories have a connection with those that we observe in nature. And for example, the one where we have propagation of bending waves down flexible filaments we observe quite frequently in reproductive systems. And here we have this mammalian sperm cell that does something similar, uses these molecular motors to propagate bending waves along the length of its flagellum. And like these rigid structures that we actuate using magnetic fields, bacteria have their rigid helices that are actuated or rotated using molecular motors at this attachment point between the cell body and the flagella. And again, it's this the geometry of these of the flagella that couple rotation and translation and allow the cell to move. Okay. And so in this talk, I'm going to focus exclusively on these rigid structures. So thinking about this, if thinking about this in biological context, thinking about these kind of bacterial swimmers. And so we have this rigid structures that we can create that couple rotation and translation. And so here are these two prime examples of this. This is the Ghosh and Fisher swimmer that's quite small, just about 2 microns in length. And there's this Zhang swimmer fabricated at the IRIS lab in ETH that's constructed using a different technique, but much longer. So this is about 40 microns in length. And both are actuated using magnetic fields. And one of the reasons why we focused on this design is because both have been demonstrated to be highly controllable. So here's the swimmer executing this H path that was, I guess, preset by the person controlling it. And these paths, these swimmers, they've also been able to control in 3 dimensions. So at some point here, you'll see in this video, they've rotated this magnetic field directing the swimmer upwards, and the swimmer is actually swimming up out of the plane towards the camera. So these swimmers are actually able to execute these very complex paths on command. So that's good. And it's good for applications. And it might seem like science fiction, but these things are actually being developed for biomedical applications, such as targeted drug delivery or minimally invasive surgery. And one of the things that I should mention that's related to this, so right now I'll be focusing on the hydrodynamic problem of optimizing and designing these swimmers, but there's a whole problem surrounding these swimmers that's also quite interesting, and this lab has been particularly successful at it, is how do you actually control them, generating these magnetic fields in time and being able to control these very small devices and using very complex magnetic field structures. And if you go to this, I should have put a web link here because I was just looking at what they were doing the other day. And in terms of biomedical applications, they're really able to develop these magnetic systems to pilot these very small bits of magnetic material in biological structures. And in this lab here are now doing in vivo experiments in various animals, exploring the capabilities of this device and related devices to actually perform surgery. So it may seem like science fiction, but it's being pursued quite actively. Okay. So in terms of the hydrodynamic problem for these swimming devices, since it's a rigid body, you can immediately write down, or you immediately know, and can write down, that the translational velocity and the angular velocity of this object are linearly related to the forces and torques by this 6x6 mobility matrix. And you also know that this matrix is really nice. It's symmetric, positive, definite. So you can immediately write this down. So that's good. But when you go a bit further and say, okay, well, let's start exploring the effects of geometry, well, you find that, well, the relationship between the velocities and the forces might be linear, but the entries themselves will depend non-linearly on the geometry of your particle. And what might be a little bit worse is that you have to go back to the Stokes equations now and solve them for a particular geometry subject to the no-slip conditions in order to explore this geometric dependence, or to get the speed, to get this relationship for a given velocity. And then what's even worse is that if you want to begin to explore how geometry affects these entries, you're going to have to perform this calculation for various geometries. And in many cases, you can do this. And when your geometry of your particles or geometry of your object is controlled by a single geometric parameter, just simply varying it by hand is quite effective. And so I'd like to point out a first example here that we worked on was looking at these chiral colloidal aggregates that are formed by these pairs of attached micron-sized particles. So here we have these doublets. When we have a large bead glued to a smaller bead, and this glue is magnetic. So in between these two particles, you have this magnetic glue. when you subject a suspension of these particles to a magnetic field, they'll all orient, so their axis is perpendicular to the magnetic field. And because of the magnetic material in between the particles, they'll exert this magnetic dipole moment and begin to attract each other. And as they attract, they begin to come together, and they'll begin to stack like a spiral staircase, which we have in this very blurry image here. And you could say, okay, well, we have this way of assembling these particles, and you can work out what these structures will be as they stack. And what you find is that how they stack will depend on the size ratio of the two beads that comprise this doublet. Okay, so you could work out the geometry. So once we work out the geometry, we know the position, we know the positions of our particles. We could start to think about solving the Stokes equations for these clusters. And so what we do is say, well, let's write down a multipole expansion for each of the particles in this cluster. And we'll say that this whole cluster moves as though it's a rigid body. So we could truncate our multipole expansion at the stresslet term and ignore, and since we don't have relative motion between our particles, we say, okay, there won't be much in terms of lubrication. And so we have this 11n by 11n system that we solve for the aggregate. And we can get the forces and torques on each of our particles. And then from that, we can get a smaller linear system that would relate the velocity and angular velocity of the cluster itself to the force and torque on the entire cluster. So that's just to give you a sketch of this calculation. And we find that something interesting happens. And so we could perform this calculation for the different size ratios. And here we plot this coefficient MB, which is this rotation translation coupling coefficient. And we have this coefficient MB as a function of the number of doublets you have in the aggregate for the different size ratios. And we find that something interesting happens when you go above a size ratio of about 2.25. And the interesting thing that happens is the sign of this coupling coefficient changes. So what it's saying is if you take one comprised of doublets with a size ratio of 2, and you rotate it in a right-handed sense, it'll move upwards. But if you take one with the size ratio of 2.25 and rotate it in a right-handed sense, it'll move the other way. And this is, even though we've stacked, this is something I should have mentioned, is that even though we've stacked the particles in the same way, the way that it responds hydrodynamically is different. And you could look at, well, everything should be related to the geometry, and you can look at the geometry of particles, of these clusters with these different size ratios, and you see that for these clusters with larger size ratios, you develop a secondary twist that's the opposite-handedness of the way that the individual doublets were stacked. So that's something that's kind of interesting that comes out of performing one of these calculations. And then the second example I'd like to show is one that's related to this Zhang swimmer. And we just said, okay, well, let's see if simple changes in geometry make a big difference. So what we developed was a parameterization of the surface of the swimmer. And we've given it a helical center line. And we've introduced this parameter gamma, which controls the rotation of the cross-section of the propeller. And so when we get gamma equals 0, we have something that looks like our original swimmer. And we have gamma equals 2 pi, we have this cross-section of the propeller oriented perpendicular to the swimming direction. And what we did was say, okay, well, a nice way to handle this is through boundary integral calculations. So that's what we did. And we said, now let's calculate this coupling coefficient as a function of this rotation parameter gamma for different values of this parameter alpha. And what you find in each case is that having this Archimedean screw type geometry will improve your swimming speed. And so this is just through varying this one parameter that controls the orientation of this cross section, we're able to make improvements of the speed of 70%. Right, so that's just through this one parameter.
So you had a gamma and alpha. I missed something.
Yes. So alpha is related to the center line. So this would be the center line of the propeller tail. Right? Gamma controls the orientation of the cross section so if you were to take a slice through the propeller, gamma controls the orientation relative to the swimming direction. Okay. But these kind of prototypical examples were somewhat easy, right? In both cases, we just had this single parameter that we could just say vary and compute what this coupling coefficient was for different values of this parameter. But are there ways to explore more parameters simultaneously? And so the answer is there is, and we'd like to do it in the case where, suppose now, instead of optimizing over the cross-section, or the orientation of this cross-section, suppose we can take an object that could be parameterized by a center line, and suppose we could bend this object any way we like. And so what we would like to do is say, determine the shape of the center line that maximizes the speed in a given direction. So we'll say z is our special direction. So we want to maximize the speed in that direction. And we're going to say that our swimmer is subject to a fixed torque in that direction. And so we're going to do this for a very specific set of boundary conditions where we specify that there's no force on our swimmer, so we're not going to pull it along. But we restrict our swimmer to rotate only about the z direction. Right? So that there's this torque, so there's a fixed torque about z, but there's also this kind of constraint torque that's keeping it rotating, keeping the angular velocity in the z direction. And so this is to kind of mimic the actuation by this magnetic field, where you have one magnetic field rotating, this time-dependent magnetic field rotating the swimmer, and another magnetic field aligning it with a particular direction. And so now I'd like to go back a bit and just say, but a lot has been done in analyzing this problem, where this problem is really related to many things that have been done in looking at bacterial locomotion and the helical tails or the helical flagella that they use to propel themselves. But in looking at this problem, in studying this problem, various theories and models are used based on what nature has given us, right? So nature has given us this particular picture that we've been trying to understand. And one of the aspects of this flagella is that it has a very high aspect ratio. So many of the studies have focused on using slender body theories in order to generate solutions to the Stokes equations, slender body theories and resistive force theories, and rightfully so. And the other thing that we get from this picture that nature has presented us is that it's given us helical shapes. So many of the studies that have been performed looking at and analyzing the geometry of these flagella has been through helices. So in thinking about this more generally is, again, limiting the number of parameters that you would have to explore your geometry. And so what we'd like to do is say, well, in many of these magnetic microswimmers that we saw, this cross-section, the size of this cross-section can't be ignored, right? So the aspect ratio of many of these swimmers is about 10 to 1, 16 to 1. So we'd like to see what's the effect of actually resolving that cross-section. And the other thing that we'd like to do is, again, move beyond having specific parameterizations of these objects and say, well, what happens? Can we explore them in a more general way? And to do this, we use some advanced techniques of shape optimization, where we don't have to make too many assumptions about the shape of our swimmer. Okay, and so 3 things come up when talking about, sorry. No, I just had how many of you have seen Inglourious Bastards, the movie? Yeah, so I was going like this. I should have gone, I guess, like this, right? I'm already going to get shot. Anyway, so 3, you need to know 3 things about 3 things in order to perform shape optimization. One of the things is the shape derivative, right? So you want to say, well, I'm going to think about this thing more generally, and I want to say, well, I need to deform my object. I want to say, well, if my object deforms, this is the right question, if my object deforms, how does that change the quantity I'm interested in exploring? And that information lies within the shape derivative. And to compute the shape derivative, you say, well, let's deform my domain. Let's deform our shape. So we introduce this, what I call this artificial velocity field, or this perturbing velocity field V, to deform our shape. And we want to say, well, how does that change the speed of our object, given by the Stokes equations? And so it turns out that this is a calculation that we write down, or every time we write down the Navier-Stokes equations, right? Because the Navier-Stokes equations is kind of the same thing as this, or as this question, where instead of saying uz, we say, well, how does the momentum change as our fluid deforms with the fluid velocity? This question here says, how does the speed change when we say it deforms under a general velocity field, not necessarily given by the balance of momentum? And so you can perform this calculation, and you can massage it a bit more, and you can relate it to 2 boundary value problems. So this is our expression that we'll use for our variation of the speed when our domain is deformed under a velocity v. And so you relate it, so we have our v, which is deforming the domain. We have n, which is the normal to our body. And then we have f and g. And f are the tractions given by our Stokes flow, or from our Stokes flow in our problem that we're interested in optimizing. So we need the tractions for that problem. And then we also have g, which are the tractions for an adjoint problem, which is, again, a solution to the Stokes equations, but for different boundary conditions. And it's this that gives us our variation in the speed for a prescribed v. And the goal of the optimization is to find the v that deforms your domain in such a way that uz is improved. Okay. All right, so that's the first bit. The second bit is saying, well, how are we going to compute the tractions on this swimmer shape that we have? That could be complicated in 3 dimensions. And for that, we use a special kind of boundary integral equation that that you can derive using potential theory. So first thing that you do is you write down a boundary integral equation for a distribution of stresslets along the surface of the body and sources and rotlets in the interior. And what you could do through a nice argument performed by Kim and Kurilla using the reciprocal theorem is show that you can derive a second kind integral equation for the tractions on the body, which is just the adjoint operator of your second kind integral equation for the distribution of stressless. And so what the second kindness does is give us a nice, allows us to get beyond the first kind equation given by the direct boundary integral the usual boundary integral equations, which allows us to solve this iteratively and avoid numerical instabilities. And so this is just showing that we know how to treat this numerically, and we could also compute this using iterative schemes and this is showing that we do, that our scheme does converge. All right, so that's the second thing, being able to compute these Dirichlet and Neumann maps. And the third thing is actually being able to use that information to update the swimmer shape. And we do this through a variational problem. So we say, okay, well, given this inner product and with the constraint that you have this length fixed, if we solve this variational problem over a space of cubic splines and a space of piecewise linears for our constraints, we find our new velocity field and allow the domain to deform with that velocity field. And you can show that this variational problem actually is well posed, and you can show that a maximizer exists. And you can also show that the solution of this actually points you in that direction. So that's something else that's nice. Okay, so what does that give you in the end? Gives you some nice movies. So so here's just an optimization where we just have one of these slender bodies. We give it, so here are three kind of representative cases from a large pool. And what we have are three different aspect ratios of the body. So here's aspect ratio 20, and it goes up to 30, and then to 50. And so here's from two different views. So here's top view, here's side view. And so let's see what happens. So we give it these initial shapes. All right, so this is when we have 20. And this is when we have 30. And here's when we have 50. Okay, and what do we get? Helices, right? So it shows us I should have probably listened to nature in the first place and taken what the bacteria have been telling us. But something that you do notice is that the helices are different, right? And so as you increase the aspect ratio of your body, the number of turns that you get increases, so the number of helical waves that you have increases, and the helical radius will decrease. So we have helices, so let's go back. Let's take one step back and say, well, I know how to parameterize a helix, and let's explore what the speed is for these different aspect ratio bodies over this two-dimensional space. And let me be a bit clever, and let me normalize the radius, the helical radius, by the radius of the cross-section of one of the helices. And when you do that, even though that these are for different aspect ratio bodies, all of our contour plots look the same. And what we find is that helices with this parameter alpha, which is the, I guess, projection of the tangent of the center line in the z direction. So this value of alpha is 0.84. And the ratio of the helical radius to the radius of the cross-section, 2.2, gives you nearly optimal values for each case. And you could use these two, if you take these fixed, you could predict that your number of waves should increase. And so what we really have is that this cross-section in this problem, this cross-section that we have, AC, is setting the length scale. And one of the things that we did do, so we reduced our space to these two parameters, is say, well, how optimal actually are these helices. So we took these as our initial conditions in our fully general optimization, put them in there, and what we see is just a slight modification of the shape. And any modification that does occur only increases the velocity by less than 2%. So these really are quite good. And so speed, right? So now you could just say, okay, well, let's plot the speed of our optimal shape. So that's these circular markers here as a function of our aspect ratio, and you see that it increases linearly with the aspect ratio. But one of the things that we did was say, well, what would you get if you had resistive force theory for these shapes? And using the parameters of alpha equals 0.84 and b over ac is equal to 2.2. And what you get is a very good, closely matches what had come out of this entire optimization. And so you might think I'm crazy for going through all this optimization, but the thing to note is that even though it does predict, or it does, resistive force theory does give you a good approximation of the speed for these shapes, it doesn't necessarily mean it can predict those shapes, right? Because what you need to do to predict the shapes is actually be able to predict or accurately give an accurate value of the speed for all possible shapes that you would be exploring. Okay, so what happens now if we make it push something, right? So what we've done is said, okay, well, let's take a sphere of radius r and stick it a small distance away from the end of one of our propeller. And we say, okay, so it's a small distance away, but the whole ensemble, so these two things, two objects, would move as though they're glued together, so they move as a rigid body. But one of the things that we allow for in our optimization is that attachment point to move along the surface of the sphere.
Do you assume that the sphere contrarotates?
No. The whole thing ensemble moves as though it's a rigid body, right? So this, again, we're thinking about this in terms of this magnetic torque rotating this entire object. Okay. So if you remember, this was our optimal shape for this propeller, and this is now forcing it to push this sphere. And so what happens is we get something different. Again, we get something helical, but something with a much longer wavelength, and with a radius, a helical radius that's comparable to the size of the cargo that needs to be pushed. And so you could be a bit more systematic. And so what we've done here is said, let's set the radius of the cross-section of the propeller, the ratio of the radius of the cross-section of the propeller to the radius of our cargo to be 0.2 and 0.4, and let's vary the length as well. And so what you find is that before we said that what we saw was that this cross-section of the propeller set the length scale of the problem, and it was and the optimal shape that you got was highly dependent on that value. Here we see, by comparing these, is that it no longer makes that much of a difference. And again, what we see is in both cases is that the helical radius of our propeller is comparable to the size of the payload, not the size of the cross-section. And the other thing that we saw, or that we can see, is that by allowing the attachment point to move during the optimization, is that this cargo has kind of situated itself right on the helical axis. That's something else. And so we could again look at the speed of our optimal shapes that we have. And so here we've plotted them as a function of r for our two different values of propeller cross-section. And probably not surprisingly is that thinner propeller cross-sections do give you higher velocities. But one of the other things that you see is that there is this, for a given size cargo, there's an optimal propeller length. Right? And I guess I should remind you that L for me means half the length of the propeller. And so what we find is that for these two cases, this optimal propeller length, or the ratio of the length to the cargo, is between 4 and 5. And a lot has been done looking at this kind of problem in terms of, well, what these cells have to push their cell body along, and they use their flagella to do this. And it's been examined looking at a bending wave type of propulsion scheme. And there they found this a slightly higher length to cargo ratio of about 12. But in Higdon's work in the late 70s, and looking at these counter-rotating bodies, so if you have a sphere attached to a very slender flagella, and you allow them to counter-rotate so there's zero torque on your swimmer, you find a very similar value of this ratio. But I think in terms of thinking about this problem in an engineering standpoint, is that when designing your propeller, you better have a good idea of the object that you're going to push, right? Because your propeller, or the optimal propeller, will depend on the size of the cargo. Okay. And then one of the last things we did was say, okay, well, we didn't choose this shape out of thin air. We chose it because we knew what the experimentalists were after, and said, how good is their swimmer? And so here we've come up with a parameterization of the one used in experiments, and found a value of the dimensionless speed to be about 5 times 10 to the minus 4. And if we optimize it based on the parameters of the swimmer, we can increase the speed by a factor of 2.5 by lowering the wavelength and increasing the helical radius of the tail. And then if we allow ourselves to also change the length of this tail and also its thinness, we can increase our speed even further. Okay, and so just to summarize, one of the things that we saw was through these optimizations that just propellers without any attached cargo, that helices do a pretty damn good job, and especially helices with these parameters. But one of the things that you needed to do in order to find this was consider the entire problem and resolve the cross-section of the helical tail. But when you introduce a payload, it changes the problem completely, and it alters the optimal shape, and that to ones where you have fewer helical turns of the tail, and one where the radius, the helical radius of the tail, is comparable to the size of the cargo. And that for a given cargo size, there's an optimal propeller length that's about, I guess, 4 to 5 times the diameter. And then I guess at the end of all this, we can say, well, we could use our schemes to actually identify improvements to existing experimentally realized swimmers. And just to give you a hint at where I think this kind of work should go, is that in this analyzing and thinking about these magnetic swimmers, we completely swept under the rug the fact that there is this magnetic field, and there is this that's producing the torque and actuating the swimmer. And the distribution of magnetic material in our device actually depends on the geometry as well. So somehow incorporating that into the optimization would be interesting. And then the other thing would be the interaction with experimentalists and understanding better the constraints imposed on the shapes that can be realized based on the construction techniques that they can use. And then finally, I guess tying this in a bit together with some of the other talks that we heard, was that thinking about this optimization techniques to actually control the interactions between swimmers and control the I guess the force distribution along surfaces, and in such a way that you can suppress these, I guess, observed orientational instabilities through hydrodynamic interactions. Okay, so I'll stop there, and thank you.
Will you obtain the same shapes if instead of the speed we will optimize energy efficiency?
So I haven't done the that optimization, but I've done, I guess after the wind was taken out of my sails and I found that you get helices, I did the same. I did that kind of parameter sweep for this kind of hydrodynamic efficiency, keeping the viscous dissipation constant when looking at how fast you can go. And in that case, I think it became, I have to remember this, it became more or less independent of the cross-section size. And one helical turn seemed to always give you the best efficiency. But I mean, don't quote me on that.
Yeah, two short questions. One, all of this is for externally actuated.
That's right, yeah.
Have you any idea if these conclusions will be very similar for torque-free swimmers?
Well, based on, right, so Higdon's work in the 70s was, he was thinking about bacteria and thinking about these kind of counter-rotating, I called it cargo and tail, but he was thinking cell body and flagellum. And he was able to get the same kinds of optimal lengths for this ratio. And I think he was also kind of predicting similar shapes, such as these. I mean, I guess in my case, I also had this attachment point changing in time, or changing throughout the optimization. But I think he was able to predict some of the same kinds of longer wavelength flagella that had a radius on the order of the size of the attached body.
I see. Just my short question on your final slide.
Yes.
You talked about suppressing those instabilities.
Yeah.
I mean, the particular instability in the picture you showed on the left is hard to escape. Basically, if you've got stresslets, if you've got pusher stresslets, to get that form of instability, the only thing you can do is push it out to larger scales or smaller scales by increasing steric or other interactions.
Right.
Otherwise, I don't know that.
Well, I think the answer is in what you said.
Yeah.
Right. You got to get rid of the stresslet. Right. So
So if you don't.
So if you could somehow optimize your shape in order to get rid of the stresslet, then you have your goal.
Can I comment on the last remark? Because actually, when you have an external magnetic field pushing everyone in your presumed
yes, then you have your torque.
That's a different story because you're aligning them as well externally. So you won't really have an instability like that to get rid of.
Yes, that's true. But let's think. Yes, but that's why I put this slide, or this image. That's why it was there. So I have performed some simulations looking at the interaction between two magnetic particles. And yes, you don't get orientation. I should revise my slide and just put suppress instabilities rather than orientational instabilities. But you do see some things that would suggest that you would get at least density fluctuations when you have these magnetic fields, or magnetic interactions as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you showed that it was you could prove that it's a minimized. It's a maximum optimized system, and it's a minimizer. Is it a global or local minimizer?
No, you can't prove that it's. You could say that one exists. So your search will lead you somewhere, but it won't say whether you will find the global one.
So your starting point is very important, essentially. So the fact that you started with things that are close to helices, maybe that you would find.
Could be. Yeah. I wasn't very bold in my choice of initial condition. But I mean, in getting back to that question, I mean, this kind of picture, at least for these two parameters where you have this very strong maximum, or this one maximum, I mean, it does kind of point in that direction that you can get actually very, very good results, and that this kind of, I guess, maximizer is one that could possibly, I don't want to say global, but at least locally very strong.
It looked like all of the optimal solutions had this kind of ellipsoidal cross section.
Yes.
Maybe you said this, but was that imposed, or was that something that
That's right. So that was fixed.
out of the optimal? Okay. Yeah.
Um,
Kind of a Johnson-esque boundary.
right. So here we have our.
Okay.
So this is our shape, and we're just saying bend this any way you can.
Got it. Thanks.
Hey, let's thank Eric again.